2024 has said some of the most tourists ever travel abroad, which is crazy when we look at human history and see patterns of people moving around, except this time it's different. It's for travel. These big patterns of people traveling around aren't colonizing or enslaving anyone, but rather enjoying the cultures of different places, taking photos, and probably posting it all over Instagram. The travel in 2024 has already surpassed travel numbers seen before 2020 COVID times, and most of this travel is going to Europe. A theory is due to the lockdowns being lifted and people having that extra cash saved from pandemic times in order to go travel around the world as they once did. Even with inflation plaguing the world and many still recovering from a post-lockdown society, we can see some of the biggest travel in history as of 2024. Some of the areas hit the hardest with tourism are the warm places in Europe you'd probably accept, like Athens, Venice, and Barcelona. Looking at Barcelona specifically, tourism has shot up to as much as 20% more than what was seen before the pandemic. I don't know if you ever traveled to these places in the summer, but that 20% difference is very noticeable. There are crowds literally everywhere, and everything seems to revolve around tourists rather than locals, which hurts the local economy. That nice weather, beaches, and picture-perfect moments are sucking the resources dry to keep up with the tourist demand. When the main seasons like summer are getting so crowded with tourists, many of the people working are young, unskilled workers who are just getting paid the bare minimum in order to keep businesses afloat. The issues have come to a boiling point when finally the summer of 2024, places like Barcelona have become fed up with the tourists and began to project that across the city with signs like "Tourists go home" and the classy and inviting "Kill a tourist." There haven't been any reports on locals actually killing tourists, but there have been plenty of protests and riots with locals shooting squirt guns at visitors. These protests around Europe are sort of helping, as putting caps on certain areas on how many visitors can enter, such as areas like Amsterdam putting a cap of 20 million people allowed to visit each year. To make sure those numbers aren't going to get passed, areas that experience a huge surge of tourists from things like cruise ships and hotels are actually banning the dockings and constructions to limit the further growth of tourism from happening. Many areas are also doing everything they can to limit overcrowding, like imposing fines and fees to visit areas and even a tourist tax for each night spent in an area, which personally, I don't understand the extra fees as any more than making extra money off of the inconvenience, but these places that are so fed up with tourists are the same places that rely so heavily on tourism and market the areas as the perfect place to visit. When the tourism industry is worth a couple $1 trillion worldwide, you can see that the marketing for those dream destinations is never going to end. The money being brought in is what is sustaining most of these places, especially if the only thing they have to offer is a dream destination. When the governments can use tourist money to fund vital parts of their cities, they don't have to worry about the locals' money doing so. And when the locals are working in tourist industry themselves, they are spreading the money being made by the industry around even more, thus supplying the economy even more. Something often overlooked is the wealth being brought in, especially from those who make dollars or euros, because when the money is being spent, it helps profits go up that much more. But the downside is the prices on your everyday items tend to also be more expensive. And as much as places like Barcelona hate tourists, they rely on that for the economy so much more than any other countries like the UK. And side note, yes, Barcelona is part of Spain, but we're specifically talking about how Barcelona is reliant on tourism. And before the Olympics in Barcelona, the tourist industry wasn't even that relevant. It hasn't been relevant since 1992, and now it's one of the fastest growing economies in the European Union. Other countries around the world that aren't as developed have seen that trend too, and have been pouring in billions of dollars to hopefully capitalize on the boom in the tourist industry. As much as the internet jokes about India or China, pretty soon they may be home to some of the best tourist destinations for people from countries like the US and Canada. As much as I'd love to see these places discover new wealth in tourism, it appears that a large draw in visiting certain areas like Barcelona, Rome, Paris, all the big cities around Europe, may be due to the rise in popularity on social media rather than actual interest. As influencers and YouTubers show off popular destinations, the desire to visit these already popular areas continues to rise. I can't imagine a popular influencer showing off some random place like Rock Springs, Wyoming, and saying, "This place is the coolest," and gathering lots of views and desire, but showing off Paris, an already well-known and desirable place, is going to gather more views and retention. Another factor to continuously visit these places may be due to new travelers or inexperienced travelers who want to travel abroad and feel more comfortable visiting well-known countries like Italy instead of a lesser-known country like Suriname. We have seen the ability to travel become much easier than ever before, as well as making it more likely tourists will want to travel, spend a few days in a place, and head to the next place thanks to budget airlines rather than spend more time in one specific area for the whole trip. It is very easy for an American to hop on a flight, go to Spain, spend a few nights there, leave, head over to France, spend a few nights there, leave, and move around the continent than it is for an American to fly over countries around Africa or even Southeast Asia. Cruise ships are responsible for this as well by making it very appealing to book day trips instead of actually spending real time in one place. You hop on the boat, and at the end of the day, you're off to your next destination. That's why Barcelona and many other coastal areas are limiting the cruise ships because they make up a large percentage of the tourism problem. And being a giant boat, it's easier to point fingers. Even if tourism was controlled a lot more and limited the surge of tourists, the cost of living in these areas has gotten so high that the locals are often priced out of paradise. Apps like Airbnb make it easy and more affordable to find a cheap place to rent while you visit, as many have capitalized on that as well. Many homes around the places aren't filled with locals, but are filled with tourists. Before the apps were even a thing, hotels separated the tourists from the locals, but now mixing them in the community causes rent to go up and less options available in general. Limiting houses available to locals makes it more frustrating as little control is being done worldwide. What used to be a local neighborhood is now a local business filled with tourists living there temporarily. So if countries are going to ban construction on hotels, shouldn't they ban apps like Airbnb? Well, some have, but it's been a messy and contentious process to say the least. You're not going to be that quirky American girl living amongst the locals in Paris. You're going to be that tourist trying to disguise as a local in front of, you guessed it, other tourists. When housing soars in prices, it relies on higher income. But if that availability is limited less and less, and maybe also cyclical, the strain on housing costs continues to price locals out of their homes and causing locals to move to other areas, which are hopefully, but not always, close to the already unaffordable areas, making those neighborhood areas also more expensive as more and more people rush to the neighboring areas to try and survive the inevitable soaring in housing costs. Venice, Italy has already lost the majority of their population because of these factors, with the area losing more than 100,000 people on the island. Even though the local population has gone down, the tourist population is still rising and filling up the island and raising the costs higher and higher. But what can even be done? Well, many things could be done hypothetically, but there's no telling if any of them would actually work. Places that are facing overcrowding can try and build more to try to keep up with the demand, but that's a slow and possible ineffective process. We see the summer times as the busiest times to visit many of these areas, especially Barcelona, so another idea is to push more tourists to visit the off-season to limit the demand in the summer, but even that may not work due to factors such as time off, weather, and just travel costs in general. Places that don't have tourists but want to could develop their cities more and more, hoping to attract tourists, but like I mentioned earlier, many tourists want to go to places that are familiar and easy to travel to rather than some new and unknown territory that might be difficult to travel to. Raising the cost could limit tourists, but how much is too much? And would the rise in prices actually make a difference? Probably not. Other factors of tourism have to do with history, location such as beaches, and many different factors where a change may work for one sector but be ineffective for another. If your dream is to visit La Sagrada Familia, you're going to do whatever it takes and spend the amount you need in order to go there. The cost hike may do little to turn you and thousands of others away from visiting those famous areas. And even though there are protests and changes possibly being done to prevent tourists, they're going to keep coming, and we probably will see even more travelers in the years to come, whether the locals like it or not.